So, good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear friends, above all also dear Dr. Lomborg. We are very, very pleased to have so many of our colleagues and other guests here today in order to listen to a very important lecture by Dr. Lomborg on issues that we are all very much interested in. I have also the distinguished pleasure to welcome our ECR co-chairman, who has insisted on coming here today in order to tell us how important this event is. And I would immediately invite our colleague, Patrick Jacki, to address us before we come into the subject itself. Please, Patrick.
Thank you so much. So I would like to officially, warmly welcome our special guest, Dr. Bjorn Lomborg. Our guest is a professor, Stanford University Hoover Institution, and president of Copenhagen Consensus Center, that brings together hundreds of the world top economists, including 7 Nobel laureates, to use cost-benefit analysis for global priorities. He is an author of excellent books, and from myself I can add that he is a very brave man. Since years, as you probably can see, even in my country there is lots of books which was very important to debate about our issues. So thank you once again, Professor, and I would like to thank our member Ferdinand Kartheiser for this initiative and for being host on this meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patrick, for addressing us. Dear friends, among the most pressing challenges facing our world today are environmental and development issues. These challenges are most visibly expressed through the climate change debate and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We dedicate enormous amounts of time to debating these topics, and we invest significant financial resources in addressing climate change and achieving our development ambitions. Despite the severe budgetary constraints that many of our countries face, with rising public deficits and far too high debt levels, we rarely pause to examine the fundamentals. How often do we step back and critically analyze the wisdom of our policy choices? Maybe more than others, conservatives are often more attuned to questioning the consequences of EU policies on our competitiveness. We recognize the risks that overly ambitious or hastily implemented measures can pose to households and industries. It is to our credit that we are carefully scrutinizing the Green Deal and highlighting the dangers it poses to our economies. However, we must ask ourselves, is this enough? Indeed, we could explore more fundamental questions. We could, for example, examine the scientific foundations and methodologies of the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or consider how its reports are received and interpreted in the political arena. Yet, this is not the focus of today's discussions. Today, we proceed from a shared understanding that climate change is a reality and a challenge to all of us. Accepting this reality, we must still ask, are we addressing climate change in a rational and effective way? When we compare our approach to that of other countries, we see divergent conclusions and decisions. The United States and probably Indonesia, for example, have withdrawn or want to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Others may follow. Many of our global competitors, such as China or India, prioritize economic development over decarbonization. These significant divergences underscore the importance of grounding our actions in sound economic and scientific analysis. Currently, the European Union accounts for only about 7% of global anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. As economies around the world continue to grow, our share will diminish further. This raises critical questions. Are the substantial investments we make and the constraints we impose on our economies justified? Are the outcomes proportionate to our efforts? Are our measures genuinely effective in mitigating climate change, or are we diverting vast resources from where they could be better utilized? To navigate these highly complex issues, we rely on the insights of highly qualified experts. One name that stands out internationally for these contributions is that of Professor Dr. Bjorn Lomborg from Denmark. We are deeply honored to welcome Dr. Lomborg, President of the renowned think tank Copenhagen Consensus, to Strasbourg today. Patrick has already made a good summary of his curriculum, so I can be shorter than I initially wanted. But let me just say that Professor Lomborg holds a PhD in political science, and he has dedicated his career to identifying the most intelligent and effective solutions to global challenges. I think he said in his biography he is looking for smart ways to do good. And that is something also that we should try to do as politicians, I think. He collaborates with hundreds of scientists, as Patrick has underlined in his words, and I think that we can rely heavily on the results of his research. Among the books that he has been writing, I would like to quote a few. I must admit I have read those books, and I'm very happy that I did so. And I passed, I think, the exam that Bjorn did when we discussed about these books. One on the development cooperation, a very recent one, is Best Things First, which focuses on maybe 12 measures that we could take immediately at low cost to make a tremendous impact. Another one has a very long title, and the title of the book is like a whole program, False Alarm on Climate Change, How Climate Change Panic costs us trillions, not billions, but trillions, hurts the poor and fails to fix the planet. A very interesting title. Another one is The Skeptical Environmentalist and Cool It. So his work offers refreshing perspectives on global warming. I encourage everyone to read these books, as they provide invaluable insights into critical issues and guide us towards more effective policy choices. While his work has sparked heated debates, as you can imagine, a testament to its impact, the quality and rigor of his research have consistently stood the test of scrutiny, earning his publications international acclaim. Dr. Lomborg's resilience in the face of criticism highlights his unwavering commitment to scientific integrity. He has shown remarkable courage and determination in defending his methods and conclusions undeterred by opposition. That means something. We as politicians, we can understand how difficult that can be very often. His work on climate change in particular invites us to reconsider conventional narratives. Are the negative impacts of climate change overstated? Are we responding appropriately? Could climate change perhaps even have some positive effects? Should we focus more on adaptation rather than solely on mitigation or on prevention? Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, today we have really a great privilege of listening to one of the world's most distinguished and influential intellectuals. Bjorn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and clearly no pressure. Thank you very much, Fana, and thank you very much, Jackie. I really appreciate the warm welcome. I'm going to take the chance of actually standing up because it makes for a slightly more engaging conversation. I like to walk around, but they told me no. So I would like to talk about how we think about the Green Deal, and what is the cost of renewables, and get us some of those arguments that are crucial to having a sensible conversation. I'm basically going to make 2 points. First of all, and I will spend quite a bit of time, we're not going to get a sensible conversation on climate before we stop being scared. If people think this is the end of the world, the discussion ends, because obviously with the end of the world, you should spend all your money on this. So that's my first target. Climate change is a problem, not the end of the world, as Fernand also pointed out. The second one is to look at whether our current policies work and how much they will cost and how much good they will do. And the short answer is they unfortunately cost way too much and deliver way too little benefit. I hope to speak for about 45 minutes, so we will have plenty of time afterwards for question and answers. So fundamentally, lots of people are scared witless with climate change. A new OECD survey shows that 60% of all people in the rich world now believes that climate change is likely or very likely to lead to the end of mankind. Obviously, that is scared. It's also absolutely wrong. As you point out, the UN climate panel, the so-called IPCC, tells us climate change is a problem. They do not tell us it's the end of the world by any means. If you care to read the 4,000 pages of reports, you will know that. I don't encourage it. It's very long and somewhat boring. But you should look at some of the research that the UN climate panel puts out. I'm going to show you some of these things, but I want to take a step back before we talk any further. Why is it we talk so much about climate change? I think, to a certain extent, this is something that happened just after the Cold War was done. Do you remember the 1990s? I mean, some of you in here I can see might not even do that. But, you know, we won a century fighting fascism and communism in the Cold War. And then it felt like it was the end of history. There was just one little, well, not so little, challenge left over. We just needed to fix climate change. It was the last big challenge of humanity. And sure, it would cost, you know, hundreds of trillions of dollars, but it was the last thing we needed to do, and then a great green future awaited. I think that was, to a very large extent, the conversation that we were being told. This was the one big remaining challenge. And so you could say the West, as Wall Street Journal named one of my op-eds, the West took a vacation from history. We decided climate change is the thing. It's important to remember most of the world was not on board. This was very much European, US, Canada, Australia, a few other countries that at certain points in time believed this. And of course, the only one that has really consistently believed it is the EU. Majority of the world was never on board. Kids dying today are just much, much more important than a fraction of a temperature change in a century. It's just as simple as that. So Russia, Iran, North Korea, obviously are strategic opponents. They're never going to incur the cost of a net zero. Remember, we estimate that net zero is going to cost Russia about 3 times what its current military expenditure is in the Ukraine. Is it going to commit those resources? No, of course it's not. But also China. A lot of people will tell you, oh, China is becoming green. No, it's not. If you look at the fossil fuel share, yes, it's slightly dipped down from 90% to about 87% today. And likewise, the renewable share has gone up from about 7% to, 10%. Yes, it's a little bit. But China mostly makes its money with coal, selling green stuff to you guys. We need to recognize that most people are just not on board. The West, of course, needs more money, and you're realizing this now, for health, education, infrastructure, and as we're now realizing, for defense. We have many other places we need to spend our resources. And growth rates are declining dramatically. If you look at this for the OECD real person growth per person, in the long run, we have seen a dramatic decline. It used to be in the 1960s, we grew 4% a year. This is how our great-grandfathers and our parents thought the world was going to be. Each generation would be much, much better. Then came the 90s, and it was just 2%. The last 20 years, it's been 1% or even less. We're not going to convince anyone that 1% is great. It's better than 0, yes, but not by much. We have many other challenges, and we have to stop taking a vacation from history. And that brings into focus what Fernand told us before. Sure, if there's no other problem, we should spend all our money on climate. But now we're starting to realize, oh wait, there's a lot of other things to do. So for a brief moment, it made sense to say after the Cold War, let's spend hundreds of trillions of dollars to changing the temperatures a tiny bit in a century. No more. Most people, most nations are not in on this. They have other priorities, and we really can't afford it. That's the background to start talking about what should we do about climate change. I think much of the current alarmism that we hear in the West, the stuff that I'm going to address just now, that we are all going to die, that your kids are going to die, that this is the end of the world, that this is an existential problem, is because that's the only way to make our current misspending make sense. And again, of course, if climate change was a meteor hurtling towards Earth, threatening to destroy all of humanity, it makes sense to say that's our only priority. If this was really the case, we should find Bruce Willis and get him up there along with everyone else and get rid of that meteor. But that's not where we are. The reality is climate change is a problem, not the end of the world. So, as Fernand also very clearly pointed out, yes, global warming is real, it's man-made, it's unfortunately often dramatically exaggerated. So I want to step back first also to talk about what is it we think about global warming. We hear that we get all these catastrophes. I'm just going to show you two, but I would love to talk more about many of the other things that we could be thinking about when we talk about climate change. The first one is going to be about hurricanes. Remember, Al Gore's famous movie has a hurricane coming out of a smokestack. That's pretty much every time there's a hurricane in the world, it's because of global warming. Of course it's not, because we've had hurricanes for a very long time. Now, we have trouble getting good long-term data for hurricanes because, remember, in times of past, we didn't have satellites to discover hurricanes. So what actually happens is, if you just look at the published record, we see more and more hurricanes. But that's simply because we get better and better at finding them. We know that we've seen an increase of about 20% since 2000, because of better technology. That is, we had 20% more hurricanes if we had had the same technology we have today back in 2000. One way of looking at this is to look at landfalling hurricanes. So the US authorities estimate that you had not had a US hurricane landfall and nobody saw it. You can have that out in the middle of the sea, but not since 1900. So if you look at the continental landfalling hurricanes for the US, since 1900, we have a good data series that we actually trust. There's no missed hurricanes since 1900. And perhaps not surprisingly, we actually see a slight decline in number of hurricanes in the US. This is the best long-term series that we have. Likewise, a lot of people will tell you, oh, but we see more strong hurricanes. Well, actually, if you look at the major hurricanes, category 3 and above, there is no indication that this is going up either. So fundamentally, we don't see this in the data. It's not that we're seeing more hurricanes. What we are seeing is more hurricanes on TV. And that, of course, makes all the difference, because all of you are faced with electorates that watch TV or watch on Twitter or do that on social media. And that's where we need to show people the data and say, yes, but this is not for real. Just like you don't see more people dying in airline disasters, you see more on TV. That's not the same thing. So again, I'm going to show you another thing that you see a lot on TV, wildfire. There we actually have much better data. But remember, this picture is a picture you want to click on, right? Everyone wants to click on these. This is clickbait. So obviously, you see every time there's a wildfire. You don't see TV cameras, I'm out here and reporting and there's no wildfire here, right? It just is not a good story. So you will constantly be seeing when there is wildfire. But we actually have good data, partly because this goes into the climate model. So if you look at global fire, that is how much have burnt in percent of global land area each year. And remember, the land area has remained pretty much constant over the last 120 years. we've actually seen a significant decline. It used to be in the early part of last century, more than about 4.2% of the Earth's surface each year burnt. Now it's down to almost 3%. This is a historical reconstruction. This is the best stuff. This is what they use in climate models. But of course, there was no satellites. But we do have satellites now. We've had satellites circling the Earth, counting all forest fires and all fires in the world over the last 2 decades plus. And this is what they show, a dramatic decline. We know this is true. We just know that there's less and less fire. Have you ever heard this? If you look at 2024, which is the last year, was the second lowest fire on record in the world. Did you ever hear that? 2022 was the lowest. No, of course you didn't, because it doesn't fit the narrative. But you need to know. What is going to happen in the future? Well, everyone will tell you, oh, there'll be more and more fire. No, actually, that's not what the models show. If we do nothing about climate, we will see a decline in the level of global fire. If we do a lot of climate policy, we will see an even stronger decline. But the important point here is to say we will see less fire, not more. Why? Because people adapt. Most people don't want stuff to burn. And that's why we make sure it doesn't. Humans are really good at that. And especially if stuff is valuable. Things don't burn near where humans are. They actually burn where humans are not. And we know this for a fact across the world. This is the main reason. So again, the point here is not to say that there's no problem. Some places it will burn more. Because of global warming, you see a lot less burning, for instance, in Africa, and this is where vast number of fires and the vast number of people are affected. But for instance, if you look at, I don't know, Los Angeles, a lot of people will tell you, oh, but there, it's going to burn more. There is some theoretical evidence that suggests that because of global warming, you're going to see more fire in the US Southwest. That's true. But actually, we have scientists who've run the models. I'm just going to show you this. So what the first graph shows, and this is their way of running the Los Angeles fires in different circumstances, is what will the Los Angeles fire look like today? That's the black line. Then the next line shows you, so the one that's 7.2% higher, shows you what will happen if you reran the Los Angeles fires, but in 2050. It's going to be 7.2% higher. So that suggests global warming does have an impact. Because it's going to be warmer and because of the changed distribution of precipitation, you will actually get somewhat of a problem. But of course, the important part is to remember, this is if we don't do very much more than what we're already doing. If we do a lot of climate policy, you get the, I'm not sure, wave, the pink one. There is a fancy name for that. I'm not good at that. The next bar over that has 5.5%. So if Europe does all of its net zero, if you get the Russia and China and India and Africa and the US, good luck with that right now, and everybody else on board with doing a very strong climate policy, by mid-century, you will now, congratulations, you will now have reduced fires in Los Angeles from 7.2% down to 5.5% less. Not very impressive, which is one of the conclusions of pretty much all climate efforts. They're incredibly costly, but incredibly ineffective. And this is what the last bar shows you. In 2050, if you don't do much about climate, but if you start fixing forest policy, that is, you clean out the undergrowth, you make sure that there's less stuff to burn, you make sure that people have better housing constructions, these simple things that we know work, that is basically make sure people can adapt. You get 15% less fire in Los Angeles. I put to you, if you're Los Angeles, what should you do first? Should you try to convince the entire world to commit economic suicide? I'm not sure what that word is in Japanese. I wanted to use it, but I'm going to get up. Yes, harakiri. Are you going to make sure the whole world commits to net zero and drives that through and have a slight increase for Los Angeles? Or are you just going to make simple adjustments to actual forestry policies? and then get a much smaller fire. Of course you should do the latter. And this is a recurring point. So what I want you to take away from this is, yes, you hear that there are more hurricanes. No, there's not. You hear that there is more fire. No, there's not. And we know this for a fact. And this is true for all of the different things that you hear. It is just not true. You see a lot more on TV, but you're not actually experiencing these dramatic increases. Again, it does not mean climate change is not a real problem, and I will show you some of the things that it will do, but it means it's not this catastrophic impact. So why is it we get it so wrong on global warming? I think fundamentally because we miss that humans adapt. We are very, very good at adapting. If I show you this graph, the number of deaths from climate, so floods, droughts, storms, and wildfires. We certainly have pretty good data for this over the last 100 plus years. How many people used to die, and how many people die today? If you ask most people, they'll think the graph goes this way, that there's more and more people dying from climate. Clearly, I'm seeing it on TV all the time. The actual truth is fewer and fewer people die, and not by a small amount. In the 1920s, on average, about 500,000 people died each year. 500,000 people, that's a lot of people. Since then, the graph has not gone as what most people would think, it's gone the exact opposite way. We have never seen fewer people die in the world than today. Why? Because we adapt, because we're smart. And of course, remember, this is even more remarkable because over the century, we have quadrupled global population. So we actually have a situation where each one of you now has much, much reduced risk of dying to the point of being more than 99% safer than you used to be. Let me just show you one example of this sort of thing. This is a full-page headline from the New York Herald from September in 1921. Death for millions in 1921's record heat wave. This is the kind of thing you could have heard in today's papers, but of course remember, when people write about heat waves, they don't usually write about heat waves in Europe or in the US because we actually have air conditioning, but they will write about India. They will talk about how 50 or maybe hundreds of people have died in India, not millions. This used to be terrible. This is not mostly because of the heat wave by itself. It was because the heat wave would basically destroy a lot of the crops, which meant that people would go on starving, and that was basically what the prediction was. But the fundamental point remains. We think that things have gotten much worse, but actually, and I think we need to get back to getting people to realize, no, that's not true. I find this is one of the best graphs to show people when they're really, really worried. This is the graph you should show your own kids, although I suspect that a lot of your kids are not very scared. But then you should certainly show it to all the scared kids in your communities and say, no, actually, you're not going to die. You know that poster that kids hold up, you're going to die from old age, but I'm going to die from climate? No, you're going to die from much older age, right? That's what we should say to the young people. So the reality is that damages have gone down, not up. Again, if you look at this, we only have good data for the world from 1990. And if you look at the actual damage in percent of GDP, as the UN also tells us, remember, if you're twice as rich, if you have twice as many houses, the same disaster will obviously flood twice as many houses. So you need to correct for wealth, and one way to do that is with GDP. What we see is a decline, not an increase, in the amount of disaster costs. Again, because we're better at handling climate change. This does not mean that there's no problem, but it means climate is not the end of the world. It's a problem. So how do we think smartly about this? I think one of the important ways, and I'm going to try to convince you to think about this, but it's a hard way to think about it, and that's why it's not winning. Climate change doesn't mean the end of the world. That's, of course, a very easy sell. Climate change means things get better, but slightly slower. That's a much harder thing, but let me show you a very concrete graph. So a lot of people worry about hunger because of global warming, and there is some sense to that. As global warming takes place, especially if farmers don't adapt, which of course they will, we might get more problems with food. It's reasonable to assume that food will get somewhat more expensive than it otherwise would have become. It's not actually an actual increase in food prices, but it's a slowdown in the decrease of food prices. But let's just look at hunger deaths. Hunger deaths is a huge problem. This is from the Global Burden of Disease estimate. We used to have in 1990 almost 7 million children. This is the most vulnerable group, and this is the ones that we've documented. Almost 7 million kids used to die each and every year. That's a terrible outcome. That has declined to about 2.5 million kids per year today. Still a huge problem, but a much smaller problem. Things have gotten better. But if there is no climate change, this is what the World Health Organization estimates would happen. We will see still ever fewer kids dying. That's great. That's a wonderful outcome. But, and then this is what the World Health Organization and lots of climate activists will tell you, but if there's climate change, many more children will die. That's technically true, but they never show this graph. This is what their numbers actually show. With climate change, it will still go down, but slightly slower. Remember, there's about 100,000 more kids that die each year than if we could sort of magically make global warming go away. But it obscures the much more important picture, namely that things get better and better and better, but slightly slower. That's a very hard argument to sell, and I don't blame you for not being able to convince your constituents. I can't convince most people with this right off the bat. But if you get people in and actually talk to them, climate change is not the end of the world. It means things will still get better, but slightly slower. Another way to look at this, and this is one of the things that climate economists have spent a very long time looking at, is what is the total cost of climate change? Well, this is what two of the world's top climate economists have looked at. I'm going to show you show you two estimates, the latest meta-studies from 2024, so last year, one from Richard Tol, who's one of the most quoted climate scientists in the world, and the other one from William Nordhaus, the only climate economist to win the Nobel Prize. What they try to do is to take all of the different estimates that are out there in the world and say, what is the impact in total of some temperature change? Remember, if temperature doesn't change, there's no impact. If temperature changes a lot, there's a big impact. And that's indeed what they find. I'm just showing you the first one. This is from Richard Tol. It marks all of the different studies. So what you see out in the x-axis is the temperature gets higher and higher. The increase in temperature gets worse and worse. And then what you see on the y-axis is how much does this impact our economy, or fundamentally it's our welfare because it's also non-economy impacts. And as you can see, there's generally a tendency to the warmer it gets, the worse it gets. So what Richard Tol estimates for a 3-degree temperature rise, which is what we somewhat conservatively expect by the end of the century, you will get, and that's where the blue X is, you will get a decline in human welfare of 1.9%. What that tells you is, in 2100, because of global warming, you are going to feel 1.9% less well off than you otherwise would be, on average, across the planet. That is certainly a problem. It's also important to say, not the end of the world. It's not 100%, it's not 80%, it's 1.9. Nordhaus uses slightly different data. I could show you all of that, and he finds a slightly higher number of 3.1%. So roughly, what we find is global warming, if we do nothing more, will mean that by the end of the century, the average person on the planet will feel somewhere between 2 and 3% less well off. Now, that's important, but it's also important to put it in context. Remember the UN estimate, this is the standard UN scenario for 2100. Remember, we don't know. This is a scenario, but this is the UN's central scenario, the so-called SSP2. On the central scenario, the average person in the world will become about 450% as rich as he or she is today. That's a fantastic development. I'm sorry to say that this is not true for the EU. We'll be twice or 200% or maybe 250% as rich. But the Indians, the Africans will perhaps be 800, 1,000% richer. That's a wonderful world. But because of global warming, we're not actually going to feel that way. We're not going to feel 450% as rich because remember, we'll actually be 2 to 3% less well off. So actually, it will feel like we will only be somewhere between 435 and 440% as rich. That's a problem. It's not the end of the world. It is incredibly important to tell people and tell kids, you're not going to be poorer by the end of the century. You're going to be incredibly much better off. And of course, especially if you live in a developing country, you are going to have a world of opportunity that you don't have today. You will be able to fly to places where you've probably never been in an airplane. You will be able to have air conditioning. You will be able to have food. You will be able to have a good education and many other things. But yes, you will only be 435% as rich as you are today rather than 450. I'm sorry. And we should definitely try to make sure that we make that loss smaller. But we should not believe that this is the end of the world. So that gets me to what we're currently trying to do, of which one is the global green deal, the Green Deal in the EU. Our current climate policies are simply both unrealistic and unsustainable, and we need to confront that. I want to first start to talk about a very simple thing. The electric car. Remember, electric cars is something that everyone loves to say, oh, that's one of the solutions of the future. But the important part is, again, we just talk about a tiny sliver of all the positives from electric cars and forget everything else. So yes, electric cars on average will save CO2. Now I'm going to show you the latest 2025 meta-study, so the study that collects all the other studies of what is the impacts of electric cars. And what they find here is if you go in the green direction, electric cars are better. If you go in the red direction, electric cars are worse. You only hear about the first one, namely that CO2 is better, which is true. You probably see somewhere between 30% is the meta-study. The International Energy Agency tells you it'll reduce emissions by 50%. Remember, electric cars will not reduce emissions by 100% because they still use a lot of power being produced with the batteries. They're typically produced in China, typically with coal. But of course, they also use electricity that's often produced at least partly with fossil fuels. But they will do better on CO2. But there's many, many other issues. And I'm just going to tell you about a few of these issues. So very clearly, there's also ozone layer. So this is essentially pollution. And indeed, there they also do better. And we shouldn't mention that. Most people don't. But we certainly should. But they also have an impact on human health. And there, on human toxicity, electric cars do incredibly worse. They're much, much more dangerous, but in China. So, to many people, that should also be a concern. And I think incredibly importantly, most people will tell you electric cars are clean. Yes, they burn cleanly in the sense that they only emit water when they're driving. Sorry, that's untrue. Sorry, scratch that. They don't emit any fossil pollutants because they don't use fossil fuels. But that's not the only thing. We know, for instance, that they actually emit more particulate matter. Remember, particulate matter is probably the worst single pollutant on the planet. Why is that? Well, that's because electric cars are heavy because of all the extra batteries. Sort of meta-studies suggest that typically electric cars are somewhere between 300 and 450 kilograms heavier than their equivalent non-electric car, so internal combustion engine. They're much, much heavier. That means that they obviously have more road wear. This is one of the things we never talk about. Electric cars will simply mean that we will wear out our roads much faster, and that's a specific public cost. But it also means they have, sorry, I didn't actually want to do that. First, I want to say the particulate air matter comes from the fact that electric cars will wear out their tires and their brakes and the roads much faster, putting up a lot of more particulate matter. So they actually outcompete gas cars, which put out particulate matter from the exhaust stream from fossil fuel use. We never talk about this. Electric cars in that way will kill more people. But there's another way, and I think this is one of the things that nobody ever mentions. This is a study in Nature magazine a couple of years ago that points out they will also kill more people. Remember, heavy cars kill more people. Heavy cars are great for you. If you drive around in a tank, nobody's going to kill you. But you will kill a lot of other people. And you will kill a lot of other cars, but you will also kill pedestrians and bicyclists. We know this for a fact. This is one of the things that have happened in the US. As everybody have gotten bigger and bigger cars, you kill all the small cars. That's why everybody gets an SUV, because it's great for you. It's unfortunately bad for everyone else. And that's what will happen as you get more heavy cars on the road. They actually estimate in this Nature article that at any realistic climate price, the fact that electric cars are heavier will totally eliminate all climate benefits. So again, if you want to start talking about electric cars, maybe we should say, I'm sorry, yes, electric cars are somewhat good for some things, but why would you put electric cars on the road that will cause more air pollution and that will kill more people? Is that your policy? And, you know, wait for the amused expression on people's faces. So we really need to realize that currently we're spending a lot of money on just regulating one thing pretty badly. And this, of course, is super costly. We know that most countries are spending in the order of 10 times what they needed to on subsidizing electric cars because most people don't want them. And, of course, because you would have sold half of them anyway, it's very likely that you end up paying 20 times the cost of what you could have cut CO2 for elsewhere. That's just dumb. There's no other way to put it. We need to get these conversations back. Of course, I can't do justice to the whole conversation. This is not a conversation just about electric cars, but it's an interesting conversation that shows if we dare put up better data, we can make much better arguments on this point. I think a much, much clearer and cleaner case for many people in the EU is the fact that green policies have dramatically driven up the cost of EU electricity. If you take the electricity cost per kilowatt hour in inflation-adjusted euro cents in the Europe area, so EU 27, since 2000, it has gone up by 75%. Now, people will obviously tell you, oh, some of this is because of Ukraine. But no, much of this is because you had access to cheap Russian gas, and I'll show you that in a second, for a while. And then, of course, you saw a dramatic increase since then because you now no longer have access to cheap Russian gas. And the reason we know that this didn't need to happen is because the US is a good counter case. If you look at the US, if you look at all their costs for industry and for households, it has stayed almost constant. It's risen by about 8%. So we know that the reason why EU electricity cost is now twice what it is in the US is mostly because of green policies. This is unlikely to be acceptable from your constituents, and it's also very unlikely to be acceptable for companies. We need to find a way to do this better, and we need to point this out constantly to people. This is the cost of doing green policies. I told you that part of this is because of Russian gas. I just want to share with you, if you look at gas prices for Europe, which is now climbing dramatically, what you see here is obviously the incredible spike that you saw in 2022, and that was because of the Ukraine war. But what you see here is after 2010 or thereabouts, we have a dramatic decline in European gas prices, mostly because you got access to lots and lots of gas from Russia. But why did it become cheaper and cheaper? Well, that was mostly because the US saw exactly the same thing until about 2005 when fracking began, And what the US, of course, has managed to do is now it makes about 3/4 of all its gas with fracking. That's one of the reasons why the US last year had the lowest cost of gas ever. EU prices last year were 4.5 times what it was in the US. Had you guys decided to frack, you could have had much of the same opportunity. Instead, you decided to say, no, we're going to get it from Russia. And yes, it worked in the 2010s. It doesn't work anymore. We need to be honest about the fact that if you have lots of energy, you have cheap electricity. If you don't, you have expensive energy. And then, of course, people will tell you, yes, but, oh, I just want to mention this because that's a fun sort of side effect. If you look at the difference between EU and US electricity consumption, we basically know that we just can't afford to use as much electricity as they can in the US. We actually use about half of what the US uses, or to put it differently, we use what the US could afford in the mid-1960s. We're just simply developing countries compared to the US. Now, do the US need to use all of its electricity? Probably not. But they certainly have better and nicer lives with it. And we would probably also like to use more electricity rather than less. But then what people will tell you is, that solar and wind will make all the difference. Well, actually not. If you look at what happens when you get more and more solar into your electricity grid, what happens to the price? Well, we have good examples across the world. This is the latest data that we have from 2022. And what you see is, try to map in all the countries in the world, and it looks like this. What you see is a very clear pattern. You have Indonesia that has no solar and wind and very low energy prices. They're possibly a little subsidized by the government. You have India and China has very little solar and wind and slightly higher prices. You have the US that have even more solar and wind and slightly higher prices again. And then, of course, you have the EU that has somewhat more solar and wind and much, much higher prices. Again, these are all prices both for industry and for households, and they're comparable across all the world. These are all in US dollars for 2022. And what you also see is the countries that are most progressive in trying to do something about the Green Deal, the Netherlands, United Kingdom, Spain, Germany, and of course Denmark, I'm sorry to say, my own country, we have even higher costs. Now, you might say, oh, but this is just because of the Ukraine, this is 2022, but actually the data looks exactly the same. The graph with the central line in 2019, but of course then people would say, oh, but that's not updated data. So the point is, as you get more and more green energy, as you get more and more solar and wind, you're not getting cheaper electricity, you're getting more expensive electricity. Everyone will tell you, oh no, if we just get a lot of solar and wind, we can get down here and get really cheap electricity. But it's a fantasy because we know that there's no single country in the world that actually provides that. The reason, of course, is, and every one of you have seen this graph, I'm just going to paint it in the air, right? But if you look over time, solar and wind prices have come down dramatically. That's absolutely true. Solar and wind is very, very cheap when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing. But when it's not, it is infinitely expensive. And you can't just say the first thing, which of course is what all the media tells you, and not say the second thing. Imagine if someone came to you and said, I have a solar-powered car, and it drives cheaper than a gasoline car. Wouldn't you want to buy that? If you just tell them that, they might actually consider it and might actually buy it. But of course, what you should have told them is also, oh, wait, sorry, it will only drive when the sun is out. Otherwise, you'll have to use your gasoline car. So you actually have to have two cars. And the only saving you got was you didn't have to use the gasoline when the sun was shining, which is kind of nice. But I think most people get that having two cars is much more expensive than savings on the gas every once in a while. And that is what we're doing in Europe and many other places. We're basically saying, let's have two systems. Let's both pay for solar and wind, and let's pay for backup. And it turns out to be incredibly expensive. Now, you can have this discussion to forever, and people will keep telling you solar and wind is cheaper. Your answer, I think, should be, but not when the sun is shining. Sorry, were you trying to tell me anything? Oh, good, all right, good. Yeah, I was like, you have to stop now. I'll be done in 5-10 minutes. But, and much more importantly, if you look at this is not a theory. This is the world. When we've asked the world, what is the cost for households and industry, this is the answer. And the answer just simply shows the more solar and wind you get, the costlier it gets. There's just no escaping that. And I think that's the strong argument that you want to show. So how much is net zero going to cost the EU? Well, it turns out that there's no net zero modeling on benefits. There's no good estimates on cost. We know that the EU has made some cost estimates. We also know that the EU habitually in the past have made dramatically underestimated cost estimates. So if you look at the only academic estimates, and this is the one that I could find from recent study by Morris et al. They've actually made an estimate of what net zero will cost the EU, and what they find is it'll cost 10.5% of the EU's GDP by 2050, each and every year. So this, we're talking about 3.3 trillion. That's why we talked about trillion in the title of the book. That's a lot of money. Just to give you a sense of proportion, the last year that we know of what the EU spending was, which is in 2022, the EU spent about 0.8 trillion. Notice how everything becomes very small when you talk in trillions. 0.8 trillion on education. You spent 1.2 trillion on health. You spent about 0.13 trillion on environment. You spent about 0.22, that's gone up to about 0.3 now, in defense. And you spent on police, law, courts, and prisons about 0.22 trillion. So if you add all of this up, and this is not just a little bit, this is everything that's spent on education in the European Union, from kindergartens to universities. Health is everything that's spent on health in the EU. Environment, everything on environment. Of course not being net zero, but all of the things that are marked up in budgets for environment. Defense and police, law, courts, and prisons. Everything adds up to 2.6 trillion. Yet we're saying, we want to cut our GDP by much more, 3.3 trillion a year. That's a terrible investment. And of course, to achieve nothing, or to achieve very, very little. Are you really saying we should spend this much money to achieve almost nothing, much, much more than we spend on education, health, environment, defense, police, law, courts, and prisons? That's probably not what most voters would say yes to. Another way to look at this is, if you look at what's the impact of making energy more costly, well, this is one of the good studies that have been peer-reviewed, shows what is the impact of the cost on the economy if you have higher energy costs. We know that there's higher costs. What they estimate is a 10% increase will, in higher energy costs results in a 0.15 percentage point lower annual growth. This is a significant cost. So the EU cost in global and for all energy, so not just electricity, might be 50% higher since 2000. This is an estimate. But if that is true, you have a reduction in growth of 0.75 percentage point. Remember, the EU average per person is only about 1%. So if you look at the EU GDP per person is about $34,000. I'm sorry, I usually use dollars, so you'll just have to live with that. It's almost euros, right? $34,000 in 2024. On this account, by mid-century, the average person in the EU will have $45,000 in real terms. That's nice. But had you not had higher energy costs, we would have had 0.75 percentage point higher growth each and every year. That would mean the average person would be $55,000 $10,000 a year. You've literally just cost each person in 2050 $10,000 or 10,000 euros for a policy that will do almost no good. That's a terrible outcome. And so what you really need to remember is people will tell you, oh, but we're just on this train. That's one of the recurrent metaphors. Well, the train for green is leaving the station and we need to be on it. No, it's not, and nobody's on that train. There's probably not even a train or even a station for sandwiches or anything. It's just a made-up metaphor. If you look at the world's share of global fossil fuels and its energy, so not just electricity, but energy across the world, we are a fundamentally fossil-fueled economy. It used to be 87%, now it's down to 82%. Yes, it's a slight decrease. But people who tell you or suggest to you that we will go to net zero by 2050 are just, not telling the truth. They're just not telling anything that looks anything like the real world. If you look from 2010, when Germany did its Energiewende, the actual decline is such that we will reach zero in 4 centuries. If you look from 1971, which is when data from the International Energy Agency starts, we will reach net zero 9 centuries from now. We are nowhere near seeing a dramatic decline in fossil fuel. Yes, we are seeing a decline, but a very slow one, because most countries know that it is good to have lots of energy. And so how do you think about smart climate? And then I'll get to what the EU should be doing, and then I'll shut up. So fundamentally, how do you do smart climate policy? Well, this is what climate economists have spent a very long time working on. This is what William Nordhaus from Yale University got the only Nobel Prize in climate economics from. That is to say, climate has real damages. Climate costs. That's true. But, and we need to remember this, climate policy also have costly damages. So you have costly damages from climate, but you also have costly damages from climate policy. Since we're the only ones to pay for this, we need to start thinking about how do we minimize the sum of these two. And nobody talks that way, but we should. And this is what economists have been doing. So the only study that has ever been done that has actually tried to estimate this is done by Richard Mendelssohn at Yale University. He tried to collect a lot of economists. It was period published in Climate Change Economics in 2023, but there was only 1 benefit study and 3 cost studies. So I'm just showing you the average of this. This is not the truth, but it's the best we know. The annual benefit of doing net zero is not zero. It's a significant number. It actually turns out to be a dramatic benefit of about, $4.5 trillion. I'm sorry, that doesn't come up. But $4.5 trillion on average across the 21st century. That is that's a very large number of money, and certainly something that means we should take this seriously. But what they find is the cost of achieving this is vastly exceeding the benefits. So the benefits are about $4.5 trillion, but the cost is about $27 trillion a year. The fact is, currently, we're thinking about spending so much money. This would be about a quarter of global GDP each year. Of course, by 2050, it'll be less because we'll be richer. But fundamentally, this is an enormous amount of money on achieving fairly little. This, of course, is why most countries will never participate, but this is also why the European Union, if it insists, will end up spending a very, very large sum of money to achieve fairly little. That's not the way to go. So what should the EU do? And I'm going to show you my last slide, and then we'll have the Q&A. I think the EU should, first of all, tell it as it is. We need to stop scaring the socks off of our children. We need to start telling them, yes, global warming is a problem. No, it's not the end of the world. That by itself is incredibly important, partly because it's terrifying to believe that you actually live in the ends of days, but also because it's not true, and also because it inhibits us from having a smart conversation about what should we do. Second one is, you should do the only realistic solution. So we worked together with 50 of the world's top climate economists and 3 Nobel laureates in trying to find out where can you spend €1 and do the most good for climate. What they told us was the only way to fix climate in the long run is through innovation. We should be driving low carbon R&D, so driving down prices so eventually everyone will shift. This is how we've solved all of the problems in human history. We've not solved it by saying it to everyone, I'm sorry, would you mind becoming poorer and less comfortable and a little colder? Would that be okay with you? You're not going to convince voters to do this for decades on end. What will convince them is cheaper, smarter, more effective policies. So technologies. So imagine, for instance, 4th generation nuclear. I'm not going to argue that 4th generation nuclear is great, but if it were, imagine if it works. Imagine if 4th generation can give us very safe, very cheap, and very convenient electricity. Everyone would buy it. Nobody would do anything else. If we can get technology that works, we've solved the problem. Likewise, there are many, many other solutions. Just to give you one, Craig Venter, the guy who cracked the human genome back in 2000, he has this amazing and slightly silly idea. He believes, what if we took an algae and genetically modified it so that it could grow on the ocean surface and soak up sunlight and CO2 and produce oil? We know we can do this. Now, we can't do it commercially viably, but we can do this. But imagine if we could do this commercially viable. We could basically all grow our own Saudi Arabias out in the ocean surface, and we would have an entirely carbon neutral economy. We could keep our entire fossil fuel economy, but it would be CO2 neutral because it came from oil that we'd just grown out on the ocean surface that just soaked up the CO2 a couple of months ago. We don't know if this will work. It probably won't. But we should be funding tons of these ideas. That's the way that we find a way that not only will work for Europe, but will also work for the US and for everyone else in the rich world, but much more importantly, will also work for India, China, and Africa. But what we should not be doing is, and that's of course what we're doing right now, subsidizing our current inefficient solution, like putting up thousands or tens of thousands of, we know already, inefficient wind turbines. We should be making sure that future green technology works, not spend lots of money on stuff we know already doesn't work. Then we should also remember that a very large part of the solution to climate is adaptation, as we showed before with hunger, as we showed with fire, as we showed with many other things, and of course everyone who dies from climate-related disaster. We are a very adaptive species, and we know that this could solve a very large part of the problem. And the last thing we need to do is to boost economic growth. Remember, if you're poor, you suffer terribly. Poor sucks. Being poor sucks, right? This is true from climate, but also from everything else. Whereas if you're rich, you basically deal with most problems. We should make sure that fewer countries, that fewer nations, that fewer people are poor, and many more people are carried into wealth and opportunity, because that's one of the ways that they will be able to tackle climate change, but also all the other problems of the world. So fundamentally, tell it as is, do the low carbon R&D, adapt, and boost economic growth. That's what you should do. That's not, unfortunately, what the Green Deal does right now, but that's your opportunity to make a better deal. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Bjorn, for this very... The first one, thank you very much. The first one is that I think that your lecture should be compulsory for all MEPs, actually. After the elections, we should gather everybody and listen to you.
Should we just do a quick vote and make that happen?
Yes. And the second, and therefore I got the message earlier on, is that I should inform colleagues that all those who are interested in the PowerPoint presentation, that you should reach out to our office. Then, of course, we share that, and also we like to stress that all this lecture has been recorded, and also we are going to share it on the social media. So I would invite you, colleagues, if you have any questions to Dr. Lomborg, please start, or if you don't have immediately question, I would like to start perhaps, because we have also a discussion on carbon taxation. And I know, Bjorn, that you are rather in favor, but we have also a discussion on competitiveness, and therefore we are also sometimes skeptical on carbon tax. So do you have any magical solution on whether we should proceed with taxation in order to reduce carbon dioxide emissions while at the same time preserving competitivity? Is there any middle way that we could choose there? Thank you.
So any economist will tell you that all other things equal, there is a socially undesirable thing from climate change, from carbon emissions, and that should be corrected with a carbon tax. But there's a couple of things that are incredibly important to say. First of all, any realistic carbon tax will not be a major part of the solution. So it will solve a little part of climate change, but not a large part. The second one is that it is very hard to get most countries to do carbon taxes, and so you may up spending all of your political capital on doing a solution that doesn't work very well. So it's certainly what hampered, for instance, American decision-making for more than 10 years. It failed in 2009, and since then we've seen almost no movement. So it is a tenuous argument, and then of course you have the problem that most countries won't participate. Now, global models will typically assume that all countries adapt the same carbon tax across all emissions, across the entire century, slightly increasing. But just imagine coordinating a single carbon tax with China and Russia and India and everybody else. That's just not going to happen. But also just remember, even in the EU, you have thousands of different carbon taxes on many different projects, because politicians love to distinguish and say, oh, this special group should not pay as much. The fundamental point here is it's a beautiful theoretical solution. It's not a bad idea to do, because it does send a signal and it also helps actually produce revenue. But, and this is the thing that almost everyone forgets, it's not the main solution. And even if you then do carbon taxes, you should stop all other policies. And this is the other thing that everybody forgets. If you have a carbon tax, of course you should not have subsidies for solar and wind and so on, because you've already leveled the playing field. If you have a playing field here and you level it twice, you end up having a situation where you make it much too beneficial for instance, solar and wind. So the reality is we've not been very good at, as you point out, with a carbon tax. It's probably not where you should spend most of your political capital. It is only going to be a smaller part of the solution. What you should be focusing on is dramatically increasing spending on low carbon R&D. Also, because that's much, much cheaper. It's 1 or 2 orders of magnitude cheaper. We're talking about, for the EU, this would be 10, 20 billion euros a year on R&D. Whereas what you're spending on a climate pact could easily be in the trillions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just one thing. No? First of all, I think that what Europe should do should follow the line of Donald Trump in the United States. Only Europe should be faster and more radical than Donald Trump, because all this is based on fear and a simple trick, as a matter of fact, a lie. I'm a geologist, and you can check what I will tell you now. No? From 1550 to 1870, we had a little ice age, and what is happening now in the world, in average, is the world is warming up to its normal And there is no such thing as something special or even climate crisis and all this rubbish. We should abolish it all. It's just stealing money, taxpayers' money, entrepreneurs' money, and give it to some lobbyists or globalists or whatever you call them. And if you don't, I say it again, trust me, just go, please, check it in geologist books. And what you will find? That we are living between two ice ages, and all times between ice ages were warmer than we are today, without any fossil CO2 or human or whatever. And not even that. In the near future, for Earth, of course, history, we had Eocene maximum, when in average, ladies and gentlemen, all the world was 12 degrees warmer than it is today, with no fossil CO2, no fossil fuels, no human, no nothing. Why? Because it's all rubbish and a lie. Because what differs? Why is the weather changing? Because of the sun. Sometimes it's a little more energetic, a little more vital, sometimes it's not, and this is what happens now. No? And we should abolish all this rubbish, especially some taxes, CO2 taxes or whatever, and we should let our entrepreneurs to be in the global size competitive again. Because we are now killing Europe, we are killing European nations, we are killing Western civilization. For example, a good example, as a matter of fact, very bad example, is Germany. Used to be a superpower. Huh? Now, after all this, what happened in the name of preserving world and, I don't know, fighting the weather and whatever you call it, what's happening? They are not a little closer to preserving the environment, but they are much closer to totalitarian socialism than they were before. And that is the real goal of all this, what's happening now. And we should abolish everything, we should go out of Paris Agreement, we should be in exactly the same direction as now is Donald Trump, but we should be more radical and faster because the situation in Europe is worse than it was in the United States in the time of Trump's inauguration. Thank you very much.
So I agree with some of the things you said. I think you're absolutely right. No, you're right that we've seen. I know. It would be nicer to be able to say that. We've definitely seen globally over the last 5 million years or so, we've seen a gradual cooling of the world and a lot of fluctuations within that. And the last, 30 million years have been much colder than the Earth used to be. Now, the problem is, when you speak to geologists, they'll say, it used to be much warmer, but of course they speak on time frames that are very different from what humans will typically talk about. You're absolutely right. We had a little ice age in the up till about 1850, and we're coming out of that, and that's part of the increase in temperature. I'm sure, and again, I'm a political scientist. I've just read a lot of this and talked to a lot of the people. They would somewhat dispute the fact that it's only that, but the whole point is, we have most of our infrastructures adjusted to the temperature that the world was in, say, 1900. And that has a cost because any change, both if it got colder or warmer, will have an impact. So it is a reasonable conversation to say, could we somewhat ameliorate that temperature increase with climate policies? And what would be the cost and what would be the benefit? That's what economists have shown. And you're absolutely right that if we do too much, it ends up being much, much more costly than the benefits that we'll attain. But I think, certainly from my point of view, and again, I'm just a lowly political scientist, I think it's just simply a better conversation to have to say, this is what the data shows, this is what the economics shows, and this is why we shouldn't be doing too much.
My point is just one. We can't fight the nature, we can just adopt, and that's all.
Thank you, and thank you for your lecture. I had a question about
the European universities. So as far as my understanding goes, the political correctness at public universities, for example, in Germany, is so bad that if you question this so-called consensus and dogma on climate, you will not be promoted, or you cannot get a chair in certain universities. Is that the case, or is it getting freer? Is it now the case where there's more academic freedom and you're allowed to criticize these theories, or is it still very this kind of culture of suppressing academic freedom and going the politically correct line?
I have to say I don't know enough to tell you where it's going. You're absolutely right that there's a lot of social stigma and there's a lot of social control in hearing the right story. And I think you could also be helpful in highlighting that in two ways. Partly, you could actually do studies like we have done in the US in looking at what is the actual distribution, for instance, of political views. I think that's just a sociological thing that would be good to know. And what we've seen in the US is a dramatic shift from an almost balanced university. So maybe 3 Democrats to 2 Republicans back in the, say, 1960s, to having sort of 9 or 9.5 Democrats and 1 Republican. And that's unhealthy in a lot of different ways, partly because universities are funded by both Democrats and Republicans, and you want to find a way to actually share that. It's also unhealthy for universities just simply because we know that if just one group runs a university, even if it was Republicans, they would be wrong because you only see one part of the world. And that's why it's so helpful to have other people say, yeah, but that's not right. And we want that. And so you could also help by pushing for more funding to be hooked up, and I'm not an expert on this, but be hooked up in some way to make sure that you don't just hire more of the same people as yourself. I think that we should make it much, much more valuable to actually have people you disagree with. And of course, in universities, that would mean we would end up with much more useful research instead of just research that keeps repeating the same phrases. But I'd also just like to point out, even with all of this, we have research. Most economic research shows that what we're doing now is stupid, and we can do much better. And so we just need to make sure that not that get quashed as well, because we need good information in order to make decisions on how we're going to spend trillions.
Thank you, Fernand, also for organizing this event. Thank you, Bjorn, for your inspiring lecture. One of your examples that I used in the election campaign, it wasn't mentioned here, so I feel compelled to do that, was the estimation that the Fit for 55 will delay the inevitable temperature rise by 2 weeks in the year of 2100. I think it's very telling. It's something that I use when I meet center-right people, because we need to realize that the path to victory here goes through the EPP and the center-right. Now, not least the CDU in Germany, I think. My question would be, what arguments you have found make the most have the most impact on people like that, who invested a lot in jumping on the green bandwagon the last 10 years, but who are now having a bit of angst because of their past decisions? Because, yeah, we really need to get the EPP on board. Just don't know how.
That's a good question, and I would actually say, so I'm very happy that you used this, and clearly it worked because you got elected. So very clearly this was, I thought it was a good argument, but it didn't go very far. It's a very technocratic argument, which I think says more about you and me than everybody else, right? It's not one that mostly wins a lot of my experience votes or minds over. I think it's much more those very simple graphs that I showed, the decline of fire over the last century and this century. That's just hard, because, and certainly if you just show it with the data part, people hear there's more and more fire and there's actually less and less. That's really surprising. The same thing with declining costs of catastrophes. The strongest, I think, is the one with many fewer people dying. So both showing the New York Herald story of millions are going to die in heat waves in 1921. Everybody believes it's going to be 2021, right? That is a strong argument, and that just fits so badly with what most people think, that it becomes this annoying piece of evidence. And I tend to think that what I try to present, I mean, I'm a data guy. I just give you data, a little bit like you are, right? I mean, this is just about saying, here's the data. And then you can make up your own mind. But I think the crucial bit of that data is to become a little bit like that annoying stone in your shoe. You know, that annoying piece of evidence that just doesn't fit your preconceived notions and that will annoy you until you change your mind. And that's what we need to get into the shoes of everyone, not just the, I'm sorry, I've run afoul in all the letter combinations, but not just your slightly less conservative brethren, but also everyone else in the European Parliament, right? Because we need to convince that. The other thing I think is incredibly convincing is the fact that Europe is increasingly becoming, after the US, that you're losing out in so many different ways, that power costs just become unaffordable. And the graph that I showed you, both about the EU costs, but I've also made some graphs for some of the outliers, so for Germany and for the UK, which are just outstanding because they've sort of seen tripling of their electricity costs. And that's really uncomfortable for most people because clearly they've tried to be green, and what they've achieved is to be incredibly expensive. That we need to get out. The cost of solar and wind, the graph that all show that the more solar and wind you get, the costlier it gets, and that there's no sort of nations down this fantasy land of green. I think those are the kinds of graphs that at least convince a lot of people to feel, ooh, this doesn't fit my preconceived notions. Now, there's going to be a limit to what data can do, and I think this is where your expertise come in, because you're good at not just telling data, but actually telling a story. And I feel a little less comfortable about doing that because I try to be a scientist, but that's where you need to have the story and connect to individual people and just simply show how this impacts individual people. And of course, that's what tractors are out doing sometimes in Brussels. But as economists pointed out, it's much easier to protest when you have a tractor. But we need to get everyone else out and do the same thing and say, I'm not going to stand up for this anymore. And I think that's what's going to convince your brethren in slightly more climate-concerned areas.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this really instructive presentation. I've got 2 points. I mean, the one is when it comes to providing incentives for research. I mean, wouldn't a CO2 price, CO2 tax, however you want to put it, basically provide exactly these incentives? And as an economist, I mean, you have clearly shown that there is a cost related to climate change. And a CO2 tax would basically, following the principle of internalizing the external cost of global warming. So I guess it would make sense. And as I said, I mean, it would probably clearly, I mean, you would have to undo all these subsidy schemes and all this bullshit, if I may say so, and I fully share your criticism of the highly inefficient Green Deal. The second thing is, I share also your view that adaptation probably makes the most sense. And you have shown quite a few ways and means how we can adapt to climate change. There's just one thing that really concerns me is, I mean, when, this issue of rising sea levels. I mean, when I look at a country like Bangladesh, where like 200 million people live pretty much around sea level, wouldn't that in the long run trigger a tremendous wave of migration? And we already have big issues with migration, not only here in Europe, but worldwide. I mean, what would you tell these people?
Great, thank you. Those are two very good questions. So the first one, absolutely, a CO2 tax provides incentive. Unfortunately, any realistic CO2 price only provides a very small incentive. And the real problem here is, we know from economics that there is a perennial underinvestment in basic research. And that's fundamentally because if you invest something, sorry, if you are a great researcher and discover something that's going to change the world in 50 years, you will never see a cent of that because all of your patents will have run out. And that's why nobody will invest in you. This is why we have very strong incentives, and we spend a lot of money on research and development, for instance, into the medical industry. We spend a lot of money on getting the people who will develop the things that eventually make Pfizer and everybody else able to make something that is marketable. We basically make all the basic research that makes it possible to do the amazing stuff that eventually ends up as products in the market. So there's a significant underinvestment in all basic research. This is the argument for universities, for national science foundations, all that kind of stuff. We do that very well in healthcare because everybody is afraid of dying. We don't do this in energy. We've actually seen declining levels of investment in energy research and development. And the carbon prices have not really helped. There's very, very little correlation. And I think fundamentally that's because you'd have to drive it up to a very, very different price level. Plus, you'd have to make companies believe that you're going to keep this for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And of course, nobody's going to believe that when there's a Trump waiting in at the exits and saying, no, we're going to undo all of that. So the fundamental problem here is both political credibility and that this is not the most effective way to do that. The effective way is just simply to fund all of these basic research. Give Craig Venter, the guy I told you about before, 20 million euros, not billion or anything, but give them small money and see if they can get off. And then, of course, once we get closer, we might give them more money, and that's how it works, and that's how we've done this for ages. And then eventually some of this will be stuff that companies will actually invest in because they can see a profile that within 5 to 10 years will turn into actually profitable products. So again, yes, you're right. Everybody will agree that a carbon tax is better than no carbon tax, but I just think it's arguing a little bit on the margin of things. So by all means, if you think you can drive that through and get China and India and everybody else on board and get this coordinated through the century, and also not get everyone turned off, which has happened, for instance, in the US and everywhere else, yes, great. But this is not the main part of what's going to solve the problem. The other one is a wonderful expression. And again, we actually did a big project, as you also, Fernand, you pointed out, that we've actually done a lot of projects in developing countries where we will look at very, very different things. So we look at tuberculosis and bad governance and education and all these other things that have incredible cost-benefit ratios, and we should be focusing a lot more on those. But we did a big project in Bangladesh, and one of the things I also got to do is look at a lot of these issues. So we all think of Bangladesh as this place where in a few years they're all going to be flooded. There's a wonderful story from P.J. O'Rourke, whom you may know, that relates a story about this American woman who was at the Bangladeshi ambassador in D.C. And he goes, "Have you ever been to Bangladesh?" And she goes, "No, I can't swim." And you understand this idea that there's this sense that they're going to be overwhelmed by the sea level rise in just a few years. Actually, Bangladesh has increased in land area since the 1960s. This is mostly because of the Ganges River that actually brings out a lot of silt. It's because of a big earthquake in 1962 in the Himalayas that's still bringing a lot of silt down. So we're not seeing that, and it's not going to happen anytime soon. But the crucial bit that we have to remember is the UN estimates for Bangladesh by 2100 is that Bangladesh is going to be rich as Holland in 2100. And of course, we don't worry about Holland. Holland knows how to fix this. And we know you can fix this. Remember, Holland has fixed most of its sea level problems for about 0.1% of its GDP. We can do that much cheaper today, and certainly Bangladesh will be able to do that with even better technology. So the short answer is no, Bangladesh is not going to be flooded, mostly because we have very cheap technology that avoids most of that. The people who do get flooded, so if you look at, for instance, the Guardian coverage, so there are some islands out typically in the rivershed, where parts of them are disappearing and parts of them are getting bigger. Overall, they're getting bigger, but the Guardian always reports from the place that's getting smaller. And yes, that is a real problem for those people who live there. But these are incredibly poor farmers, typically, or they're not even farmers, and they have no political power. That's their big problem. And again, we have to ask, if you want to help them, how do you help them best? By changing the temperature a slight bit in 100 years, or by making sure they don't die from easily curable infectious diseases, their kids get good education for a fraction of that cost and right now? And the answer is obvious. Thank you.
Bjorn, I have to tell you something, because we have a lot of specialized programs also in the European Union, and there are two that I would like to mention now. The first one is a scientist protection program, and that applies to you because you have already worked for quite some time now, and we have also to take care of your well-being. And the other one is the interpreters protection program, and also our colleagues in the cabins have worked a lot, so we are coming, I think, to the end of our discussion today. I would take perhaps one very last question, because, but please make it short, because also our interpreters and so on would like to conclude for today. So I would invite you to ask perhaps a short last question, and then we conclude the meeting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, you held your speech here in one of the world epicenters of climate ideology, I would say. Not in this room, but in this parliament. And so I have a general one and a specific question. So the general one, do you have any idea why climate ideology, especially here in Europe, has become so successful? And the more the specific one is, even when all presumptions for climate policy are right, there are some decisions which are really hard to understand. Example one, you have since 2019 the definition by EU law that electric cars are emission-free cars, zero-emission cars. Also, you need emissions for producing them, for running them, and for the disposal. And so when you produce as a company electric cars, you don't need to pay any fines. Possibly, when you construct cars with combustion engine, you possibly have to pay fines when they have too many CO2 emissions. And another example, as a German, I unfortunately have to say, Germany decided to destroy all nuclear plants, although they are considered as more or less CO2 emission free. And so even when you follow the logic of climate policies, then these decisions are hard to understand. Can you explain why such decisions come true or not? Thank you very much.
Thank you for asking two very simple questions I can answer in a few words. So the first one, why is climate so successful? I can't give you a straight answer, but I think a large part of it is because it speaks to a fundamental worry about stuff. And that's what sells papers, that's what sells both newspapers and get clicks online and TV channels and everything. It's just much, much more fun to click on bad news. We know that people just love that much more. If you ask people, they will tell you, I want to read positive stories. But then give people a pile of good news and a pile of bad news and leave them alone in a room and they'll read all the bad news. We're just like that. And I think climate policy and climate change is just the perfect analogy of everything that can go bad. Remember, the ozone layer was only bad for some things. Acid rain, only bad for some things. It was hard to relate to and nobody really cared. Climate change is about everything. You can just literally make it about everything. I don't know if my favorite bad story about climate change is the guy who hunted for Loch Ness his whole career, the Loch Ness monster. And he gave up in 2013 or 14, and he gave up because clearly climate change had killed the Loch Ness monster. And you're like, okay, then everything can be about climate change. But it's a fun, and it made it into the BBC News, and it's a good story. I would read it. I did read it. So the other one is, why do we make all these silly policies? And I think that's exactly the same thing. Because climate change is about everything, you can literally subsidize everything. And that's, of course, the most wonderful state for people who are subsidy farming, who basically live off of you guys giving them money. And so you have that from the electric car industry, and that's just wrong. I think a much better example is actually how biofuels, and especially essentially burning wood, has become carbon neutral. No, it's not. It emits more CO2 than coal, and it's in all kinds of ways worse because it pollutes a lot more. It relies on the theory that if you cut down some wood, you will eventually replant it and then it will grow back. Yes, but in, I don't know, 100 years. That's not how we usually work this. So we made all these bad decisions. I think the fundamental reason why we've done that is because we needed some solutions. Electric cars feel like, oh, that's a solution. Biofuels, of course, is incredibly important. If you notice, most of Europe doesn't run on solar and wind. It runs on biomass, because biomass is a reliable power source. This is what you can actually run an economy on. It's not a good idea, but you can run it on biomass. And that's why you've made these decisions. So again, we need to challenge these decisions and expose their silliness. And I think that's one of the ways that we can help make us a little more sane. But honestly, I know that you've had Schellenberger here before, and I know him well. He at one point pointed out that we will only stop worrying about climate change when we get something else to worry about, which is a terrible but it doesn't seem entirely implausible to me. And so what he said was, we'll stop worrying about global warming once the middle classes start worrying about AI taking away all their jobs. I think it's an interesting point. I'm not sure it's true, but that would be terrible if that's the way it is, because then, of course, we'll just go overboard on AI instead, as it seems like we're doing. So, thank you.
Thank you, Bjorn, and thank you all for being here. I want also to thank our interpreters and technical staff. For me, it was a fantastically interesting afternoon that we spent together. First of all, Bjorn, you have grounded us again. You have brought us back to realities, and that is something that is often missing in politics. And I would say it also reminds us of the importance of disagreement, because you have shown so much courage being basically alone or not with very many people defending a different point of view, and we are all now benefiting from the fruit of your work and your courage over years in order to be able to better bring forward these reasonable arguments that we need in politics. So you are a little bit the salt in the climate debate, and we are certainly going to pick it up and continue your work in our fora here. Thank you very much, Bjorn, for being with us today.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening, all of you. Thank you very much for being here.